The man sitting across from Emma kept clenching his hands, his eyes darting toward the two children whispering beside her. She knew this moment too well. The moment a man realized he didn't sign up for a package deal. Emma set her glass down and looked straight at him. "If you want to leave because I have 2 kids, then say it now." The table went silent. His face turned pale. And Emma wondered, would he stand up and walk away? Or would this be the first time someone stayed? It was supposed to be a simple dinner. Emma had planned everything. A quiet restaurant, a decent dress, and 2 hours of adult conversation without interruptions. But life had other plans. Her babysitter called 45 minutes before the date, voice thick with apologies, and something about a family emergency. Emma stood in her bedroom, phone pressed to her ear, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She had 2 choices: cancel the date or bring her kids along. After 3 years of failed attempts at dating, she was tired of canceling. So she texted Daniel the truth and hoped for the best. His reply came quickly. "No problem, see you there." 4 words. No emoji. No reassurance. Emma read the message 3 times, searching for something beneath the surface. She found nothing. Maybe that was the problem. She grabbed her purse, called for Lily and Max, and headed out the door with the familiar weight of doubt pressing against her chest. This was her life now, dragging her children into situations they never asked for, hoping strangers would see them as something other than baggage. The restaurant was a family-friendly place on the edge of town, the kind with crayons on every table and sticky menus that smelled faintly of syrup. Emma arrived 10 minutes early. She chose a booth near the window, where she could watch the parking lot and spot Daniel before he spotted her. Lily sat beside her, quiet and observant, her 7-year-old eyes already too wise for comfort. Max bounced in his seat across from them, asking questions about everything: the lights, the music, the people walking by. He was 5 and had no filter. Emma loved that about him, even when it made her nervous. Daniel walked through the door at exactly 7 o'clock. He was taller than his photos suggested, with dark hair and the kind of face that looked like it hadn't smiled in a while. He scanned the room, found Emma, and started walking toward her. Then he saw the kids. His steps slowed just enough for Emma to notice. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a flicker of hesitation, maybe surprise. He recovered quickly, smiled, and slid into the seat across from her. But Emma had seen it. She always saw it. "Hey," Daniel said, his voice steady but careful. "Sorry if I'm late." Emma shook her head and told him he was right on time. She introduced Lily and Max, watching his face for any sign of retreat. Lily offered a polite hello without looking up from the menu. Max stared at Daniel with open curiosity, the way children do when they haven't yet learned to hide their thoughts. Daniel nodded at both of them, then looked back at Emma with an expression she couldn't quite read. The table fell into an awkward silence, and Emma felt the familiar tightness in her stomach. Max broke the silence first. "Are you Mom's new boyfriend?" The question hit the air like a firecracker. Emma's face flushed. She opened her mouth to apologize, to explain, but Daniel was already shaking his head. "I don't know yet," he said, his voice caught somewhere between honesty and panic. "We just met." Max considered this answer for a moment, then shrugged and returned to coloring his placemat. Lily, however, kept her eyes on Daniel. She didn't say anything, but Emma knew that look. Her daughter was evaluating, measuring, deciding whether this man was worth trusting. It was the same look she had given every man who had walked into their lives and then walked right back out. Emma tried to keep the conversation moving. She asked Daniel about his job, his hobbies, the usual first date questions that felt hollow under the circumstances. He answered politely but briefly, his eyes drifting toward the kids every few seconds. She could see him calculating, weighing the situation, trying to figure out what he had gotten himself into. It wasn't cruelty. Emma knew cruelty. This was something else. Fear, maybe. Or simply the realization that dinner with a single mother meant something very different from dinner with a woman who came alone. The memory hit her without warning. 6 months ago, she had sat at a different table with a different man. His name was Michael, and for 3 weeks, he had been perfect. He texted her good morning every day. He remembered the names of her kids even though he hadn't met them. He told her she was beautiful and meant it. Emma had started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found someone who could see past the complications of her life. Then came the dinner, when Michael finally met Lily and Max. Everything changed in an instant. Michael watched the kids with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He answered their questions with one-word responses. By the time dessert arrived, Emma already knew what was coming. He walked her to her car that night and stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking at the ground. "I really like you, Emma," he said, "but I'm not ready to be a father to someone else's kids." He said it like he was doing her a favor, like honesty made the rejection easier to swallow. Emma nodded because she didn't trust her voice. She drove home in silence while Lily stared out the window and Max fell asleep in his car seat. That night, as Emma tucked Lily into bed, her daughter looked up at her with confused eyes. "Did we do something wrong, Mom?" The question broke something inside Emma that she hadn't known was still intact. She told Lily no, of course not. It wasn't her fault. But the words felt like lies, and she wasn't sure Lily believed them. From that moment on, Emma promised herself she would never let her children feel like obstacles again. She would be upfront. She would be direct. She would give men the chance to leave before her kids had the chance to get attached. Now, sitting across from Daniel, she saw the same signs she had seen with Michael. The nervous glances, the careful distance, the way he held his body like he was ready to bolt at any moment. Lily leaned over and whispered in Emma's ear, "I don't think he likes us." The words were soft, meant only for her mother, but they cut deep. Emma looked at her daughter's face and made a decision. She was done waiting for the rejection. She was done pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. If Daniel was going to leave, he was going to do it now, not 3 weeks from now when her kids had already started to hope. She set her glass down on the table with a quiet thud. Daniel looked up, startled by the sudden shift in her expression. Emma met his eyes and held them. "If you want to leave because I have 2 kids, then say it now." Her voice was calm but firm. "I'd rather know tonight than 3 weeks from now." The words hung in the air between them. Max stopped coloring. Lily turned to watch Daniel with an intensity that made him shift in his seat. The restaurant noise faded into the background, and for a moment, it was just the 4 of them suspended in silence. Daniel's face went pale. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Emma could see the war happening behind his eyes, the part of him that wanted to run fighting against the part that wanted to stay. She had seen this battle before, and she knew how it usually ended. Men were good at making excuses. They were good at promising to call and then disappearing into the void. She braced herself for the inevitable, already preparing the words she would say to comfort her children on the drive home. But Daniel didn't stand up. He didn't reach for his wallet or mumble an apology. Instead, he took a deep breath and looked at Emma with something that might have been respect. "I'm not going anywhere," he said slowly. "At least, not tonight." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a declaration of love or commitment. It was just a man admitting that he didn't have all the answers, but was willing to stay long enough to find them. Emma studied his face, searching for deception and finding none. She nodded once, a small gesture that carried more weight than words could express. Max grinned and went back to his crayons. Lily's expression softened just slightly, though her guard remained up, and Emma, for the first time in longer than she could remember, allowed herself to feel something other than dread. It wasn't hope. Not yet. But it was close enough. The rest of the dinner moved slowly. Daniel tried to make conversation, asking Emma about her work and her favorite places in town. But every sentence felt forced. He spoke like a man walking through a minefield, careful not to say the wrong thing. Emma answered his questions and asked a few of her own, but the ease she had hoped for never came. Between them sat an invisible wall built from awkwardness and unspoken fears. The kids didn't help. Max kept firing questions at Daniel like a tiny interrogator. Do you have kids? Where do you live? Do you have a dog? Will you sleep at our house? Each question made Daniel's face tighten just a little more. Daniel answered as best he could, his responses short and uncertain. Yes, he had a son. He lived about 20 minutes away. No dog, and no, he wouldn't be sleeping at their house. Max accepted these answers without judgment, but Lily remained silent throughout the meal. She picked at her food and watched Daniel with eyes that seemed far too old for a 7-year-old. Every now and then, she would lean toward Emma and whisper something too quiet for Daniel to hear. Emma would nod or shake her head, and the conversation would continue as if nothing had happened. Daniel pretended not to notice, but Emma could see it bothered him. Then the accident happened. Max reached across the table for the salt shaker and knocked over his glass of water. The liquid spilled across the table and onto Daniel's lap before anyone could react. Max's eyes went wide with fear, and he immediately looked at his mother, waiting for her to fix the situation. Emma grabbed napkins and started apologizing, her words tumbling over each other in a rush of embarrassment. She had seen this moment before. The moment when a small disaster revealed a person's true character. Some men would laugh it off, others would get angry. Most would use it as an excuse to cut the evening short. Daniel looked down at his wet pants, then back up at Max. The boy's lower lip trembled slightly, and his hands gripped the edge of the table. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel let out a small laugh and shook his head. Well, at least it's not coffee. The tension broke instantly. Max's face split into a relieved grin, and even Lily's expression softened just a fraction. Emma stopped dabbing at the table and looked at Daniel with new eyes. It was such a small thing, a simple joke in response to a child's mistake. But in that moment, it meant everything. They finished dinner without any more incidents. Daniel paid the bill despite Emma's protests, and they walked out to the parking lot together. The night air was cool, and the kids ran ahead to Emma's car while the adults lingered near the entrance. Daniel shoved his hands in his pockets and looked at Emma with a half smile. That was interesting, he said. Emma laughed, a real laugh that surprised even her. That's one word for it. They stood there for a moment, neither one sure what to say next. Finally, Daniel told her he'd like to see her again, if she was willing. Emma said yes before she could talk herself out of it. 3 weeks passed. They saw each other 4 more times, twice for coffee while the kids were at school, once for a movie, and once for a walk in the park where Lily and Max tagged along. Each meeting felt a little easier than the last. Daniel began to relax around the children, asking them questions about school and their favorite cartoons. Max warmed up to him quickly, chattering about dinosaurs and superheroes without any of his earlier suspicion. Lily took longer. She answered Daniel's questions politely, but never volunteered information. She watched him the way a cat watches a stranger in its territory, alert, cautious, ready to run at the first sign of danger. Emma noticed small changes in Daniel during those weeks. He started remembering details. Max's favorite ice cream flavor, the name of Lily's stuffed rabbit, the time Emma's lunch break ended. He texted her good morning most days and called her at night after the kids went to bed. They talked about everything and nothing, the kind of conversations that build bridges between 2 guarded hearts. Emma found herself looking forward to his messages, checking her phone more often than she wanted to admit. But beneath the growing warmth, a familiar fear waited in the shadows. She had been here before. She knew how quickly things could change. One evening, after Emma put the kids to bed, she and Daniel sat on her porch with glasses of wine. The neighborhood was quiet, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic. They had been talking about work, about dreams they had abandoned, about the small disappointments that pile up over the years. Then Emma asked the question she had been holding back for weeks. "You have a son, don't you?" "Lucas." Daniel's hand froze halfway to his glass. He looked at her with surprise and something else, something that looked like shame. Emma explained that she had done some research. She wasn't proud of it, but she needed to know who she was letting into her children's lives. Daniel set his glass down and stared at the wooden boards beneath his feet. He told her about Lucas, his 6-year-old boy who lived with his ex-wife across town. The divorce had happened 4 years ago, and it was his fault. He had worked too much, traveled too often, and by the time he realized what he was losing, it was already gone. His wife got primary custody, and Daniel got weekends. But even those weekends felt hollow. Lucas barely knew him, treated him more like a distant uncle than a father. Daniel said he understood why. He had earned that distance through years of absence. Emma listened without interrupting. She had expected excuses, justifications, the kind of defensive explanations men usually gave when confronted with their failures. But Daniel offered none of that. He simply told her the truth and let it sit between them like a weight neither of them could lift. When he finished, he looked at Emma with eyes full of something she hadn't seen before. Genuine fear. "I already failed one kid," he said quietly. "I'm scared I'll fail yours too." The words hit Emma harder than she expected. This wasn't the fear of commitment she had encountered in other men. This wasn't selfishness dressed up as honesty. This was a man who understood the cost of his mistakes and was terrified of repeating them. Emma reached over and touched his hand. She told him that everyone fails sometimes. The question isn't whether you'll make mistakes. It's whether you'll keep trying anyway. Daniel nodded slowly, but she could see he wasn't entirely convinced. Still, something shifted between them that night. The conversation moved from the careful territory of new relationships into something deeper and more honest. Emma realized she was no longer just evaluating Daniel as a potential partner. She was starting to see him as a person, flawed, afraid, but trying. It was more than she could say for most of the men she had dated since her divorce. The weeks continued to pass. Daniel became a regular presence in their lives, showing up for Saturday breakfasts and Sunday afternoon movies. Max started calling him Danny, a nickname that made Daniel smile every time he heard it. He taught Max how to throw a football in the backyard and let the boy climb on his shoulders to reach the high branches of the oak tree. Lily remained more reserved, but even she began to thaw. She showed Daniel her drawings one afternoon, explaining each one in careful detail while he listened with genuine interest. Emma watched these moments from the kitchen window, her heart caught between joy and terror. One night, Lily came into Emma's room after her bath, her hair still damp and her rabbit tucked under her arm. She climbed onto the bed and sat cross-legged, looking at her mother with serious eyes. "Mom, is Daniel going to be our new dad?" The question knocked the breath out of Emma's lungs. She had been waiting for it, dreading it, hoping it would never come. She told Lily that she didn't know yet, that these things take time. But Lily just nodded like she had already figured that out for herself. "I hope he stays," she said softly. "He's nice." Then she slid off the bed and went to her room, leaving Emma alone with the weight of her daughter's hope. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through every possible outcome. Her children were getting attached. They were starting to love Daniel, to count on him being there. And if he left, when he left, it wouldn't just be her heart that broke. It would be theirs. She remembered Lily's face the night Michael walked away, the confusion and hurt that no amount of explanation could erase. She had sworn she would never put her children through that again. Yet here she was, letting another man into their lives, letting them believe in something that might disappear at any moment. Emma started pulling back. She canceled a dinner date, claiming she had too much work. She kept conversations short and avoided making plans for the future. When Daniel suggested a weekend trip to the beach with all the kids, she said she'd think about it, and never brought it up again. Daniel noticed the change. He asked if everything was okay, if he had done something wrong. Emma told him everything was fine, just busy, just tired. But the excuses sounded hollow even to her own ears, and she could see the confusion growing in Daniel's eyes. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening. Daniel showed up at her door unannounced, his face tight with frustration. The kids were at their grandmother's house for the night, and Emma had been planning a quiet evening alone. She let him in because she didn't know how to turn him away. They stood in her living room, the space between them charged with unspoken tension. Daniel asked her directly what was going on. He said he felt like she was pushing him away, and he deserved to know why. Emma tried to deflect, tried to change the subject, but Daniel wouldn't let her. Finally, something inside Emma broke. The words came pouring out before she could stop them. "Because my kids are starting to love you," she said, her voice cracking despite her efforts to stay calm. "And if you leave, it won't just break my heart. It will break theirs. So if you're not sure, if there's any part of you that wants to run, do it now. Not later. Not after they've called you Dad. Now." The room fell silent. Emma could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She had laid everything bare, exposed her deepest fear to the one person who had the power to confirm it. Daniel stood there, his mouth slightly open, searching for words that wouldn't come. Emma watched him struggle and felt the last fragile thread of hope begin to fray. She had seen this before, the moment when reality crashes into fantasy and fantasy loses. Men always had reasons. They always had excuses. They always found ways to make their exit seem reasonable, even kind. She waited for Daniel to explain why this was too much, why he needed more time, why he cared about her, but couldn't handle the responsibility of 3 children who weren't his own. But Daniel said nothing. The silence stretched between them, growing heavier with each passing second. Emma felt her chest tighten as the truth became clear. His silence was the answer. His inability to speak was the confession she had been dreading. She nodded slowly, more to herself than to him, accepting what she had known all along. "I think you should go," she said quietly. Her voice was steady now, drained of emotion. Daniel opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. He looked at her one last time, his eyes filled with something that might have been regret. Then he turned and walked out the door, closing it softly behind him. Emma stood alone in her living room, listening to the sound of his car starting in the driveway. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stood there, feeling the familiar emptiness settle back into place. She had been right to be afraid. She had been right not to hope. And now she had to figure out how to explain to her children that Danny wasn't coming back. Emma didn't move for a long time after Daniel left. She stood in the middle of her living room, listening to the silence that had become so familiar over the years. The house felt emptier than usual, as if Daniel's departure had taken something with him that she couldn't name. She walked to the window and watched his taillights disappear around the corner. Then she turned off the lights and sat on the couch in the darkness, letting the weight of the evening settle over her like a heavy blanket. She had done the right thing. She had protected her children. So why did it feel like she had lost something precious? The next morning, she picked up Lily and Max from their grandmother's house. They bounced into the car full of energy, talking over each other about the cookies they had baked and the movie they had watched. Emma smiled and nodded at all the right moments, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept rehearsing the words she would need to say when they asked about Daniel. It didn't take long. They were barely 5 minutes from home when Max piped up from the back seat. "Is Danny coming over today?" Emma gripped the steering wheel tighter and told him that Danny had to go home. Max accepted this without question, already distracted by something outside the window. But Lily was quiet. Emma glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her daughter watching her with knowing eyes. That night, after the kids were asleep, Emma finally let herself cry. She sat on the edge of her bed with her face in her hands, tears streaming through her fingers. She cried for Daniel, for herself, for the hope she had allowed to grow despite every warning sign. She cried for Lily, who had started to believe that maybe this time would be different. And she cried for Max, who had given Danny a nickname and wouldn't understand why the man with the kind laugh had stopped coming around. When the tears finally stopped, Emma felt hollow. She had been right not to hope. That was the only thought that brought any comfort. Daniel drove home with his hands tight on the wheel and his mind in chaos. Emma's words echoed in his head, repeating themselves over and over until they lost all meaning and then found it again. She had asked him to choose, and he had frozen. He had stood there like a coward, unable to give her the answer she needed. The worst part was that he didn't even know what he wanted to say. Part of him wanted to stay. Part of him wanted to run. And the part that won was the part that said nothing at all. He had walked out of her house and driven away, leaving behind 3 people who had started to count on him. The drive took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Daniel pulled into his driveway and sat in the car for a long time, staring at the dark windows of his empty house. He thought about Lucas, his son who lived across town with a woman who had once been his wife. He thought about all the weekends he had missed, all the school plays he had skipped, all the bedtime stories he had never read. He had told himself it was because of work, because of circumstances, because of things beyond his control. But the truth was simpler and harder to accept. He had been afraid of failing, afraid of not being enough. And that fear had cost him everything. Daniel finally went inside and turned on the lights. The house was quiet and clean, the kind of clean that comes from not having children around. He walked past the kitchen and into the living room, where a single photograph sat on the bookshelf. It was Lucas at 2 years old, grinning at the camera with a toothless smile. Daniel picked up the frame and stared at his son's face. He remembered the day the photo was taken, a Sunday afternoon at the zoo, one of the last good days before everything fell apart. Lucas had been so happy, so full of trust. He had believed his father would always be there, and Daniel had let him down. The realization hit him like a punch to the chest. He was doing it again. He was running away from people who needed him because he was scared of not being perfect. He had stood in Emma's living room and said nothing because silence felt safer than commitment. But silence wasn't safe. Silence was just another form of abandonment. Emma had asked him a simple question. Was he going to stay, or was he going to run? And by walking out that door, he had given her an answer he didn't even mean. The question wasn't whether he was good enough. The question was whether he was brave enough to try. 2 days passed. Emma went through the motions of her life, making breakfast, driving the kids to school, sitting through meetings at work. She smiled when she was supposed to smile and laughed when she was supposed to laugh. But inside, she felt numb. Lily asked about Daniel once more, and Emma gave her the same answer. He had to go home. Lily nodded and didn't ask again, but Emma could see the disappointment in her daughter's eyes. It was the same look she had worn after Michael left. Emma hated herself for putting it there again. On Saturday afternoon, Emma was in the kitchen making sandwiches when the doorbell rang. Lily ran to answer it before Emma could stop her. She heard her daughter's voice, surprised and uncertain, followed by a deeper voice she recognized instantly. Emma wiped her hands on a towel and walked to the front door. Daniel stood on her porch, his hands shoved in his pockets, and his expression somewhere between nervous and determined. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a small boy, with dark hair and wide eyes, clutching a stuffed dinosaur to his chest. Emma looked from Daniel to the child, and back again. her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Daniel spoke first. "I spent 2 days thinking about what you said. And you're right, I was scared. I'm still scared." He took a breath and continued. "But I realized something. I'm more scared of leaving than staying. I don't want to be the guy who runs, not anymore." Emma didn't respond. She couldn't find the words. Daniel gestured to the boy beside him. "This is Lucas, my son. I wanted you to meet him because if we're doing this, we're doing it right. All of us." Lucas looked up at Emma with shy curiosity, then glanced past her to where Lily stood watching from the hallway. Max appeared behind his sister, his eyes lighting up when he saw Daniel. "Danny!" He pushed past Lily and ran to give Daniel a hug around the legs. Daniel laughed and ruffled the boy's hair. Then Max noticed Lucas and his dinosaur. "Do you like dinosaurs?" he asked immediately. Lucas nodded, still too shy to speak. Max grinned and grabbed his hand. "I have a T-Rex in my room. Come on." The two boys disappeared into the house, leaving the adults and Lily standing at the door. Lily looked at Daniel for a long moment, then at her mother. Something passed between mother and daughter, an unspoken question and an equally silent answer. Lily turned and followed the boys inside. Emma stepped onto the porch and pulled the door partially closed behind her. She and Daniel stood facing each other, close enough to touch, but neither one reaching out. Emma searched his face for signs of doubt, for the hesitation she had seen so many times before. She found fear there, yes, but she also found something else. Resolve. Daniel wasn't pretending to have all the answers. He wasn't making grand promises he couldn't keep. He was simply standing in front of her, showing her that he had chosen to come back. "You came back," Emma said finally. Her voice was quiet, stripped of the defenses she usually wore. Daniel nodded. "I did." They stood there for another moment, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. Emma crossed her arms, not in anger but in self-protection. "Don't make me regret this," she said. Daniel met her eyes. "I'll try not to." It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were no tears of joy, no dramatic embrace, just two people who had been broken by life, choosing to take a chance on each other, despite everything they had learned about disappointment. A few weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, Emma sat on a bench at the local park and watched her family. Daniel was teaching Max how to throw a football, patiently adjusting the boy's grip and cheering every time the ball went more than a few feet. Lucas and Lily sat on a blanket nearby, drawing pictures with colored pencils. Lucas was showing Lily how to draw a dinosaur, and she was pretending to be impressed, even though Emma suspected she could draw better. The sun was warm, the sky was clear, and for the first time in years, Emma felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Peace. She thought about everything that had led to this moment. The failed dates, the broken promises, the nights spent crying alone. She thought about Michael and the way he had walked away without looking back. She thought about Daniel's silence in her living room and the 2 days she had spent believing he was gone forever. None of it had been easy. None of it had been guaranteed. But here they were, 5 people with 3 different last names, trying to build something that looked like a family. Daniel glanced over at Emma and smiled. It was a small smile, tired around the edges, but genuine. She smiled back, not the bright smile of new love, but the quieter smile of someone learning to trust again. He wasn't perfect, neither was she. They were 2 broken people with 3 kids and more baggage than any relationship should have to carry. But for the first time in years, Emma wasn't waiting for someone to leave. She was watching someone try to stay, and maybe that was enough. Maybe love didn't begin when fear ended. Maybe it began when you chose to stay, despite the fear.